Hi, fantasy readers. This is Karyne Norton, your fellow book binger, and you are listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where you can test out a new fantasy story every single week to find your next favorite author. Today's story comes from the unique view of a gnome, but not just any gnome, one who recently returned from an adventurous quest and is trying to settle back into gnome life. It's written by Cathryn deVries, a Stewart and Haddo Short Story Prize winner and a recovering perfectionist. She's spent the last 15 years homeschooling her 4 children, 2 of whom are on the autism spectrum, and has co-written a romantic epic fantasy trilogy with her neurodiverse daughter. She loves speculative fiction as well as the classics, and uses both to influence her own work. Stick around to the end or check out today's show notes to see where you can find more from Cathryn. For now, please enjoy Lightning Hunter by Cathryn deVries. There'd been a storm last night. Tana popped her head out of the tree bole, eager hands grasping the still moist branches. She grinned. There'd be lightning caps for sure. Inhaling like her life depended on it, Tana drank in her surroundings, the glorious forest of the south hearkening woods. Droplets still glistened on the leaves, the early morning sunlight turning them into millions of tiny diamonds, throwing rainbows. Crisp and clean, the air tickled her cheeks, carrying bird calls on its refreshing currents. And all around her, the rich smell of humus ignited memories of sunshine. Living underground had its advantages, but she'd never tire of sights and sounds and smells like these, nor of the night sky, or dragonflies, or wildflowers. A small argument broke out below, and the ladder shook a bit. All at once, Tana's face dropped, and a dull ache weighed her heart. She lived between 2 worlds now, not quite part of either. It had been 7 moons since she'd returned from the quest, but home still didn't feel like home. That experience had changed her in ways she could never have anticipated when she had insisted on coming along with Astariel. And now, she didn't fit in anymore. Gnomes just weren't supposed to long for the surface like she did. No, gnomes were supposed to adore their underground world and all its quirkiness, and feel smug about their self-reliance and ability to elude the notice of even elves. They were supposed to whirl from one thing to the next with carefree abandon and never think further ahead than the next festival. And most of all, they weren't supposed to have feelings that a good joke couldn't fix. Tana's restlessness had been at its worst over the winter, after the stories of what she'd done and been through were no longer new, and the initial glow of her celebrity status had faded. When life went on as it always had, and she was truly stuck down in the burrow. All the familiar festivities had gone on around her, but she had felt alien and disappointed. Tana Trouble Bubble Fenstone had never been disappointed. Frightened, yes. Angry, sometimes, especially with her brother Alton. But Tana True Friend Fenstone often felt this now. And very, very alone. "Hurry up, Tana," called Dimble from behind. "We don't have all day. You staying here or going out?" Tana threw a scowl at her brother. "I'm going out. Hand me up my staff," she said. Dimble did, and she grasped its smooth shaft, lifting it level with her face. As always, the moonstone orb at its head hovered in its twisted wooden cradle, defying gravity. It, too, lived between worlds. Tana traced a sigil and spoke over the stone, coaxing it into a soft glow. She listened. Droplets falling, deer grazing, lizards in the undergrowth. Every sound within a bow shot was amplified and catalogued in the blink of an eye. Safe, Tana called, and jumped down from the tree. One of the hundreds the gnomes used to exit their burrow, it was situated in a copse far from any forest trail, for their aim today was not a visit to the elven citadel, much as Tana would have loved to wander its treed heights, but to hunt for mushrooms, in particular, lightning caps. With a couple of dull thuds, her brother Dimple and sister Zana landed beside her. Her other sister, Orpla, and eldest brother, Alton, not far behind. "Let's split up," he and Tana said simultaneously, but for vastly different reasons. Alton grimaced, and Tana frowned slightly. This relationship in particular would never be the same, for even though she was the youngest of her siblings, she was the more powerful mage now, and Alton resented that fact. And although his days of being the bane of her existence were well and truly over, so was the freedom of having nothing much expected of her. She'd been instrumental in saving Erebus, and couldn't just muck about the burrow anymore, not that she wanted to. That was another thing that had changed about her. It was not something any of the other gnomes truly understood, even those in positions of authority. But it was why she had been put in charge of this expedition. From inside her messy mop of sandy hair, Mist, her fey gecko, sensed her disquiet and chirruped an encouragement. "Okay," said Tana. "Alton, you go north. Zana and Orpla, you take the east. Dimple, west. The south's mine. We'll meet back here at noon. Now, let's hunt." She turned towards the south and took a deep breath. This was supposed to be fun. Without a backward glance, Tana stepped off, making barely a sound on the wet leaf litter, her lurid cloak somehow helping her to blend in with her surroundings. Over the years, she had embroidered it with every pattern known to gnome, and elvenkind, and then some. Even feathers from the remains of a magic boat trimmed the hood. As she skirted a mound of boulders, putting her out of sight of the secret entrance tree, Mist nuzzled Tana's cheek. Tana scratched her tiny head in return. They'd been through a lot together, and would get through this uncomfortable time too. "I do hope we win," Tana said to Mist. "Maybe then, with this slightly silly success under my belt, I'll be able to relax and really enjoy myself again. And have something normal to talk about." Being crowned Lightning Hunter of the Year was quite an accolade, and Tana had actually won a few times. She seemed to have a bit of a knack for finding the mushrooms, and enjoyed their flavor immensely. They were fabulous in savory pastries. Though not quite as spicy as those fermented into skillin, the beverage all gnomes viewed as their greatest contribution to Erebisian cuisine, lightning caps were a rare treat, as they could only be found after a spring storm. Half the burrow would be out looking for them today, hoping to be the lightning hunter. It was a very gnomish achievement, and that's what Tana wanted. To feel absolutely gnomish again, not half something. Tana scanned the terrain, even levitating occasionally to get a bit of height, but all around was green and brown, with the occasional pop of red or yellow berries. She grabbed a few to munch. What was it about the surface that called to her so? The burrow was just as beautiful, with its glittering rock formations, bioluminescent plants and animals, and gems aplenty. Gnomish stonework, too, was quite renowned, and the playful way bridges and staircases were arranged made every excursion entertaining. And then, of course, there were the other gnomes, with their laughter, curiosity, and fabulous inventions. Really, being part of burrow life should have satisfied her, like it seemed to satisfy everyone else. So why didn't it? She sighed. The old Tana had been more than satisfied, but the new Tana lived a deeper life, one that she couldn't share with anyone. Oh, she'd tried, but even those who admired her didn't change in response. And how could they? She was the one who'd left the burrow. She was the one who'd faced her nightmare. And she was the one who'd caught a glimpse of things far more important than the next feast. The fundamental stuff of life and the beyond. Mist chirruped, interrupting her thoughts, and Tana heard excitement in the tone. Burning wood. She'd smelt burning wood, and that almost certainly meant a lightning strike. Tana's more melancholy thoughts were brushed aside for the moment, and she sucked in an excited breath. The mushrooms would be all over the place at the strike site. Her basket would be full to overflowing. She might even have to improvise another one to hold them all. She quickened her pace. This was it. The title would almost certainly be hers. Maybe someone else would find a strike site too, but they probably wouldn't be from her burrow. The others from around here would find only much smaller patches. Hurrying round some giant trees, Tana clambered over a pile of boulders and up a slight rise, then stopped. She'd been right. The mushrooms were everywhere, their small, glowing caps, reminiscent of a water droplet or tiny flame, held atop long, thin stems. They covered the ground for a good 2 body lengths around the base of a tree virtually split in two, its smoldering trunk still wafting little wisps of smoke into the damp forest air. But Tana paid hardly any attention to either the tree or the mushrooms. Instead, she sucked in a sharp breath and bit her lip. Frozen. No. No. Weaver's mercy. In amongst the glowing caps, a hargriff foal nuzzled its dead mother, trying to wake her. No. Why? Tana leaned heavily on her staff, caught between approaching and fleeing, unable to look away as the baby let out a questioning cry. Crest raised in alarm, the little creature butted its beak against a head slack and unresponsive, then scratched at the prone equine body with a tiny talon. Letting out a pitiful shriek, the small hargriff cantered hither and thither in distress, immature wings flapping uselessly, then tugged at the charred feathers of its mother's wing in yet another attempt to rouse her. A tear slid down Tana's cheek. The pair must have sought shelter from the storm, and the lightning had found them. For a moment, the little hargriff just stood there, wings extended, watching, waiting, hoping. Then, slowly, like a dream dissolving, its wings and crest began to droop. Somehow, it realized its mother was not going to wake up. With one last keening shriek, the baby hargriff tunneled under its mother's wing and lay down beside her, its dark head resting against her rose-gray withers. It now knew the truth, but didn't know what to do. It would die without her to hunt for it, but it would not leave her. It was too young. The wood of the great tree continued to smolder, and a branch fell away, crushing the lightning caps on the far side. Oh no, that was a quarter of the harvest gone. Tana took a step towards the glowing treasure, then glanced at the Hargriffs. No, she was here to collect mushrooms, to win the title and feel like a normal gnome again. Turning away, she skirted the edge of the blanketing cover of glowing fungi and began to pluck the caps and place them in her basket. A dozen, a score, 2 score. From beneath the wing of the mother Hargriff, a whimpering cooing sounded, and Tana felt ashamed. Here she was, gathering mushrooms, whilst another creature mourned the loss of its mother. A small, doomed creature. Tana gulped as passages from Hargriff handling and husbandry sprang to her mind. She'd pored over the text as soon as Archmage Altimus had returned it to her not too long ago. Some time or other in her young life, she'd dreamt of having a Hargriff as a flying mount, a dapple gray, like this foal would lighten to, and then, incredibly, had actually got to ride one briefly when escaping with Astariel. So she knew about Hargriffs. She knew what they liked to eat, their habits, breeding cycles, and grooming needs. She even knew how to train one. Could she? No, it would be ridiculous. She picked a few more caps. And yet, to have one for herself. As the Hargriff let out another mournful cry, she suddenly felt guilty about her desire. Never, ever had Tana considered that a tragedy would be the path to her childhood dream. But it couldn't really have happened any other way, could it? How else would the first Hargriffs had been tamed after all? Only a dead parent would let their baby be taken from them. What was she thinking? She couldn't take this Hargriff foal back to the burrow and tame it. Another dozen mushrooms made it into her basket. And yet, this orphan would have no chance if she didn't help it. Tana looked at her half-filled basket, then at the baby. She felt awful. What was being crowned lightning hunter compared to saving a life? And this little life could become a companion, one that would remind her of adventure, one that could comfort her in her loneliness, and one that needed to come up to the surface frequently. A fish out of water, just like her. Or not quite. For here was a creature that naturally lived between worlds, a child of the forest and sky. A bridge. With strengthening resolve, Tana left her basket on the ground and took a pace forward, slowly, silently. She fished a morsel of food from her belt satchel. Rotten mushrooms. If only Astariel had been here. Her elven friend could have soothed the little creature with her song. But she wasn't. Still, a bit of food might work just as well. From her shoulder, Mist chirruped, then scurried inside the haven of Tana's messy hair to hide. Tana didn't blame her. The fey gecko would make an excellent Hargriff snack. The foal had rested its head upon its talons in sorrow, but a yellow eye startled open as Tana approached. A shriek of panic, escaping its large hooked beak. Always before, its mother must have responded to that shriek, but not now. Still, it buried itself further under her wing, instinct taking over. Tana bit her lip again. What should she do? If it became too afraid, it might run away. Its wings were still too immature for flight, but still, she'd never catch it. She tossed the food close to the mother Hargriff's shoulder, hoping the baby would understand. A whole minute passed, it seemed, but eventually the beak cautiously poked out and snatched the morsel. Tana sighed in relief. Tossing another piece of food and another, she crept closer and closer until she was crouched just in front of the wing. "Come on, little one," she coaxed, holding a bit of jerked venison in her fingers, desperately hoping the Hargriff foal wouldn't nip her fingers off. She needed those fingers. How else would she trace sigils? Not that any magic she knew would be the least bit helpful now. All she could do was shoot fire or ice or lightning. She didn't want to think about lightning. The Hargriff delicately took one end of the piece of jerky and tugged. Tana let it go and replaced it with another, shuffling back slightly at the same time. The little head poked out from beneath the lifeless wing, yellow eyes wary, yet full of hunger. It grasped the food, but this time Tana didn't let go. "Come on out, little one," she said. Hours had passed. Tana could scratch its head now, but she wasn't sure it would follow her, because she'd run out of food. Her own stomach grumbled and her lips were parched. The Hargriff had guzzled her entire supply of water, too. Really, she had to get back to the others. They'd be wondering where she was. It was past noon already. Trouble was, Little Dipples, that's what Tana had named her, was still too attached to her mother, though she was stiff and cold. Even now, she returned to the shelter of her wing whenever something startled her. Would Tana have to leave her behind after all? She'd die. Scavengers would come for the carcass of the mother, and Dipples would fall prey to them, or escape only to fall to wolves, or starve, or... No, she couldn't leave her behind. But how could she take her back to the burrow? She couldn't bear the idea of betraying Dipple's trust by lassoing her neck and dragging her away, even if she was confident that she could match the Hargriff's strength, which she wasn't. What should she do? Betray the foal with abandonment or force? She'd feel awful either way, but one kind of awful was slightly worse. So she wouldn't let Dipples die, not if she could help it. Though their connectedness might be compromised, letting her die was something Tana couldn't live with. Biting her lip, she withdrew a length of rope from her belt satchel. She tied a loop in the end. Feeling like a traitor, she put her hand on the edge of the mother's wing to lean in and give Dipples a reassuring scratch, before slipping the rope over her unsuspecting head. Wait. The wing. If Tana could somehow become her wing. The mother's pinion feathers were huge. She'd only need a few. Dropping the rope and taking her dagger, she cut some free and retrieved a needle and thread from her belt satchel. A few more feathers on her cloak would look amazing. Curious, Dipples watched as Tana made a wing, but when Tana put the cloak back on and spread it over the young Hargriff's back, the little creature shied. Tana was nothing if not persistent, though. She knelt down by the mother's shoulder and made her cloak an extension of the tunnel formed by the wing. Dipples crept forward a little, crest erect and still cautious, but also fascinated. Taking the edge in her beak, the little Hargriff tested it, then came out a little further. Tana flapped the cloak on the far side, just gently, and Dipples' neck stretched to see. Her body followed, and Tana rose, the cloak draped around the foal. On, off, on, off. Tana accustomed Dipples to the sensation of the cloak, and when Tana walked away a bit, Dipples followed. Joy mounting, Tana flapped her cloak like the edges were indeed real wings, and rather than shying, Dipples' crest half rose, head tilted. She spread her own little wings. All at once, the two were prancing around, Dipples crushing a multitude of lightning caps beneath her small talons and hooves. Glowing spores puffed out and surrounded their ankles, like some heavenly cloud. Tana could almost believe they were flying together. Finally, Dipples dove under Tana's cloak and nuzzled her midsection, something like a warble escaping her raptor's beak. It was cozy and dark under the cloak, and must have smelt like a mixture of her mother and Tana, her new food giver. Tana scratched the little Hargriff under her crest and chin, and let out some cooing noises of her own. "Let's go, Dipples," she said. "It's time to go home." "Finally," Alton huffed as Tana's head came into view. "You'd better have found a ton of lightning caps in payment for making us wait this long." "Oh, I did," Tana called, "but I couldn't collect that many." "What do you mean you couldn't His voice trailed off. "Is that a—" began Dimple, beside himself with excitement. They could see Dipple's dark shape now, high-stepping next to Tana, wings folded and crest erect. "Yep," said Tana, a silly grin on her face and feathered cloak flapping behind. "What? How?" said Alton, his jaw dropping open. His eyes flicked to the glowing treasure beside him. Suddenly, his almost certain-to-win basket of lightning caps must have seemed pathetic, for he stamped a foot, then made a disgusted noise. "How are we ever going to get that thing into the burrow?" "Hike to a bigger entrance," Tana said, taking charge again. "You always have to be different, don't you?" accused Alton. "Do something bigger and better than the rest of us." Tana blinked. "Do you think I brought Dipples here just for attention?" she said. "She was orphaned, Alton. She would have died." Did he honestly think everything she did now was some kind of performance, and that he had to put her back in her place? Back in the neat box that had served so well for so long? The box he was comfortable with? "Everyone else was out hunting lightning caps, and you... He shook an angry hand at Dipples, and she shied beneath Tana's cloak. "You scared her." Tana smoothed the feathers on Dipples' neck in an attempt to calm them both down. "This is ridiculous," Alton said. "Why can't you just be a gnome, like everyone else?" Weaver's mercy. That was what she had wanted. The box he was trying to put her in was the very one she had set out that morning to reoccupy. But after hearing him say it, she realized she didn't want to climb back in. "Hey, Alton," Zana, the second oldest, said. "Leave off, will you?" Tana dropped her shoulders. She wouldn't fit anyway, any more than Dipples would fit down this tree bowl. "No," said Alton. "Tana can't just do stuff like this and expect everyone to fawn all over her. She's got to learn that she's still a gnome, and still the youngest." Just another gnome in the burrow. Except Tana already knew it wasn't that simple, and she didn't want to become smaller again for the sake of anyone else. She wouldn't be comfortable doing that. But she wasn't comfortable in her new skin either. She kept stroking Dipples as she looked at Alton, and the awkward silence between them all dragged on. Either way, Whether she tried to live within his expectations or not, she would be uncomfortable. But just like one kind of betrayal was worse than the other, one kind of discomfort was worse too. She had to accept the full reality of who she was now, both the things that had changed and the things that hadn't. Discomfort and all. She drew herself up. Yeah, I guess I am, she said, and gave Dimples a scratch behind her crest. Then she smiled, understanding blossoming. The very words Alton had intended to put her in her place with, Tana now used to claim an enlarged territory. Yes, she was still a gnome, despite everything she'd been through, all the challenges that had forced her to reshape her thinking, all the ways she had changed. She was still a gnome. And she was different. Perhaps always would be. But underneath both of those things, she was still Tana, the youngest daughter of King Sirkin. That would never change, though what it looked like had and might again. It was the simple truth, had always been the truth. Everyone else would either see it or they wouldn't. Come with me if you want, she said, or not. It doesn't bother me either way, as long as you don't scare Dimples again. She smiled and scratched the Hargriff behind her crest once more. Tana wouldn't win the coveted title of Lightning Hunter this year, nor her ticket back to simple gnomishness. But she had won something much more important: the trust of an orphan, and the reassurance that even though she had changed, she still belonged. If the others never changed, that was fine. If they never understood, that was fine too. Each of them was on their own timeline, so Tana would live hers. And it would be easier now, because something else had changed. Something else was new. Tana had someone to share her oddness and expansion with, in the burrow, in the forest, and eventually, in the air. I hope you enjoyed listening to Lightning Hunter by Cathryn deVries, narrated by Karyne Norton. If you want to read more by Cathryn deVries, she's part of a mother-daughter writing duo, and they have a romantic epic fantasy trilogy coming out in the near future. But in the meantime, you can snag a copy of Cathryn's short stories, Lightning Hunter and When a Slave Falls, by signing up for her newsletter at eclectaperennial.com. I'll also have direct links for both short stories in the show notes. I have to admit, I was so excited when this story showed up in my applications. I know you're all aware of how much I love bittersweet stories, but I also love when characters are deeply affected by their circumstances. And it's not just that I want everyone to be sad, it's more that I want them to find joy while still having scars, just like Tana did in this story. The simplest example I can think of is comparing Harry Potter's final chapters to Hunger Games, and I won't spoil it if you haven't read the books, but when you read one, everything is wrapped up neatly and everyone seems fine. But when you read the other, amidst the goodness, there's a lingering pain, which feels so much more real to me now that I'm older and I see the way the hard things I've experienced in life still sit with me in a really healthy way. I could probably give you several more examples and go on and on about it, so I'll stop there, assuming you probably already either completely agree with me or completely disagree. And don't worry, I don't begrudge anyone who wants the perfect happily ever afters. Because, in fact, we have a few of those stories coming up in the near future to keep the podcast well balanced. If you haven't already signed up for the Finding Fantasy Reads newsletter, you'll find a link for that in the show notes as well. Each week, you'll get an email letting you know what episode has been added. But I also include links to deals on audiobooks, new releases, and freebies from our featured authors, as well as anything else that I think might interest someone who enjoys fantasy audiobooks and short stories. I hope you're having a great start to the new year, and I'm excited for all the stories we have coming in 2025. Thank you all for listening, and happy reading.